Hey there, everyone. My name is Logan Zimmermann, and I am here to talk to you today about practical game sound for all types of artists, lesson workflows, and takeaways. Um, my name is Logan Zimmermann, and I am a SCAD alumni of the ITGM department 2024, and I am currently a game sound designer at Garage Collective. Um, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've learned, what I wish I knew when I was in school about sound, and kind of how you can have a baseline knowledge for game sound because it's something that I think sometimes people look at it and they're like, oh, I don't even know where to start with that. And so my hope is to take away some of the confusion while also providing some really applicable things that would have helped me when I was in class because a lot of this stuff is stuff I only really started learning when I started having to do it every day. So, why do any of this? Professor Mamaya said something that stuck out to me, which was that sound is 50% of the sensory experience in games. And it's all about just like how you put all this effort into your visuals, you really want to think about your sounds because they just do so much for immersion and making it feel like a full experience. So, we're going to jump right into it. We're going to talk about how to build an ambient loop. And so I'm going to describe to you a scene, which is, we're on like a mountainside and there's trees and birds and water and all these things. And, when you've got a scene like that, you're like, okay, you type into your search engine thing, all right, wind and birds. And let's say we found this sound. And everyone can hear that all right, right? All right, cool. So, that's a nice sound. We could call it there. Be like, all right, we did our job. Sound is designed. But that would be leaving a lot of opportunities on the table because it's so much more than just one sound. And even though that's a real recording of the real world, that's not always what it feels like to be in the world. Just like how photography doesn't always capture what it feels like to be in a space, you have to sometimes do a lot of planning and shooting and editing, and you can't just expect to capture the emotion of something without a little bit of effort. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start pulling in other layers to build what we call a compound sound. And for example, here's another layer that I liked. This is a nice ocean, gentle breeze sort of thing. And we start already throwing those two together. You start to feel we're starting to create a space. And then, but there's not only close waves, we've got some distant waves. And it's a little bit of subtlety that's going to even out the mix. And then, this is where things get really interesting. People often forget about insects. Insects are a huge part of what builds the world around us and how it sounds. They're everywhere. And so you have to think about things that you can't always see because in this scene, like in a lot of games, you're not going to see an individual cicada, but you're definitely going to hear them. And so here's the one I liked for that. And I did something interesting to this sound too, where I applied a little bit of reverb to it. And if you don't know what reverb is, it's the effect of where you make something sound spacious. And I'm going to be kind of focusing on teaching this stuff in a way that can apply to any DAW, digital audio workstation. So I'm not going to get too much into the specifics of what I'm doing in this DAW, which is Reaper, but just know that everything I'm describing should be possible in something like Audacity or Pro Tools or anything else. So, for example, when I first found this sound, it's pretty chirpy, it's pretty bright, but I wanted it to be distant, so I put a little reverb on it. Now, we got one more thing that we're going to do to this sound to really push it, and that's these sounds shouldn't be static because, when we've got that sound, it's like, okay, we're sitting, we're hearing the cicadas, but that's not what it's like to be in a space. Things ebb and flow. And so when we've got all these different things interacting with each other, that's what really makes a compound sound, is bringing things in and out. And so, for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cicadas here, and I'm going to fade them out here. and then bring them back in a little bit, like that. And so now we've got this dip. I'm gonna, yeah, it's a little slow of a dip, but you know, and then we've got a section here with nothing, and then we're gonna bring it back in. And I'll show what that sounds like in context. And another way that we can add this movement, these moments of ebb and flow, is sounds that are spurious, like a crow, for example, which, you know, they call, but they're not always talking. So, and now we throw all that together and look at how we went from this to this. And this is the scene that I was imagining when we were building this. And I think it's a really unique example of how you can imply so much depth and feeling and ebb and flow and space just by how you choose to layer your sounds. I didn't record any of those sounds for this. This was all made with things that I found on websites like Freesound and using things. I'm personally using my own library now that I've graduated, but when I was in school, I used the SCAD sound library. We'll talk a little bit about that. But you don't even have to be going out there and recording stuff yourself to get good sound. Now, granted, you should because it's fun, but you know, if you're short on time. Anyway, this is all to say, don't just drag and drop. Now, there's something to be careful of though, because I have done this. You're having a lot of fun. You're throwing in sounds and you're like, ooh, check out this sound. All right, and you throw that in and, oops, that's a bit much. You know, we've muted out the things. We can't hear any of the detail. But it can be hard to realize that sometimes. So, you know, come back to your sounds, listen to them, and if you're like, you know, I'm not sure if this is working, try turning off individual tracks, because sometimes you add a little bit too much. And so when in doubt, cut it out, because basically frequencies, they're not just stacked, they interact. And when you've got too much of one frequency, it can actually make it harder to hear the others. So, you know, try things out, experiment, but also don't be afraid to remove stuff. It doesn't always have to be additive. Now, all right, we just made this awesome sound. Okay, but how am I going to get that to play in the game? Do I have to make it 10 minutes long? That's going to be so much. Okay, before we worry about that, we can actually do something to save space and time, which is called a seamless loop. And I'm going to show you an example of one here. And basically, sorry, I just got to switch between these things all the time. So we take a look at this guy right here, and I'm doing something in the background there. Okay, so we've got a sound, and you see how it starts and ends. Well, when we load this into a game engine, we're going to want the game engine to automatically loop it back around. And we want it to be seamless, like this. Now, that isn't always easy to do. It's actually deceptively easy sometimes because you're like, oh, of course, you know, I'll just cut it like this and loop it around. But sometimes, if it's not quite perfect, you're going to get something kind of weird. And I'll show you an example of that here. That one actually worked too well, so that's okay. But here's an example of it being weird. And you heard that little clack, that little clip, right? And that's going to really throw people off because not only is that uneven, but sometimes if you're unlucky, that sound can be loud. Like especially, I was working in the thing and I was like, okay, you know, I think this might loop okay. And then I put on the headset and I was like, heard like the loudest click in the world out of nowhere. And where does that come from? That is a problem when a sound file jumps from a high volume to a low volume very quickly. And to understand how we avoid that, we need to talk about something called a zero crossing. Now, when we look at a sound wave, you might be confused of what we're even looking at, but it's basically a measurement of the amount of energy that the wave has. And a zero crossing is the portion where it currently is not holding any energy. It's at 0. And this is important because we know that sound is a wave, but it's not, we don't hear things this way. It can be hard to understand what we're looking at here. And so to understand why this is happening and why we have to cut it this way, we can think of sound as being what it is, which is a wave of pressure sections of the air that go in and out, and they move our ears in and out. And this is useful to know because when we look at a speaker cone, speakers move in and out. And what happens when you jump from a high volume to a low volume is that speaker cone moves too fast and produces a sharp sound. And that is called a clip. And it's not good. And it sounds bad. And so basically we have to be careful when we're looping our sounds. And so let me show you what that looks like. So when we're pulling this one in, we can zoom all the way in. And a lot of tools will let you do this in different ways. But you can see that we can actually zoom into what is called the sample level, which is where we can see the individual energy levels of this sound. And as it kind of plays, you can see that it moves up and down. And it can be kind of hard to contextualize what we're looking at there. But the important thing to know is that when it crosses over that 0 line, no energy is being transferred in that one instantaneous moment. Now notice that this is at 48,000 times a second. So each of these samples, 48,000 of them make up 1 second. So, you know, it can be kind of hard to think of that way, but it also shows how, like, even it just being a sudden jump across that short of a time period can really make a weird and uncomfortable loop. So what we can do is we can find a 0 crossing and cut it, and then put the piece right here. So we just looped it back around where we found a part where it's at 0, split it, and put the front part, and I'm cross-fading it with the back part, meaning I'm putting this part and making it fade out, and making this part fade in, so that way now, when it loops over, it will pick up exactly where it was and exactly on a 0 point. So let's hear what that sounds like. And look at that, it worked. And it's a really important thing because that's a 10-second loop, but you're gonna have to listen to it for a while to actually notice, like, it's not as obvious as one would think. And that's a really critical thing because the way most people loop their sounds is like this, where they just have it and then they just press loop. And you can hear that loop. And you know, it's gonna be painful when people are in your game and they hear that. So it's really important to look into how your tool can do this, because you might be looking at that and be like, that looked like a tedious process. But all sorts of different tools have different ways to do this. Now in this one, through some script extensions, Reaper has tools to create 0 crossings. So look into whatever tool you're using and just like search, like, you know, Adobe Premiere 0 crossing or something. Find, because most likely they have a button that'll do it for you, like this one. And that button, I just clicked it and now boom, it just did a 0 crossing loop for me. Didn't even have to do anything. Now, I mentioned all this again because it's really important, because it allows you to utilize your time and space very carefully, because you're not making 7-minute long loops where you're duplicating the tracks and stuff. You can actually be very concise with your file usage and your spacing and get a lot out of a short time period when you carefully make sure that they loop in the right position. Now, that's a lot. Okay, so takeaway, compound sounds. Shape your sounds because they shape your game. And we're gonna talk about that even further in an analogy that I came up with, which is sound is a texture. That's often how it's described. And we've got textures in games. They're usually image textures. And they're more related than I thought, because let's say I'm in a scene and I'm designing a brick. I could just go on textures.com and be like, oh, brick image, call it a day. And for a game that's just deep in the background, or all of the game looks like that, you know, you can get away with that and it might work. but you might be more stylized. You might have more art direction. You might really want to have to put some things in specific ways to make people feel a certain way when they look at the whole. And that might take a little bit more work. And then you might be working on the next Call of Duty and they're like, we need hyper realism. So you break out Substance Designer and you make a ton of nodes and you connect a bunch of stuff. And that same concept can apply to sound, where here we've got, just a sound I found and, put it in, it works. Awesome. But sometimes you might need to take a bit of time and develop those compound sounds. And sometimes you might need to really develop them, where if you're like, in a sci-fi base and you want like different beeping and whirring and doors opening, and you don't want to just start with something basic. You want to tailor it to what you need. And it's important to try mixing different layers and feel out how complex your end environment needs to be and what sort of sounds will support it. And to paraphrase something that Professor Gashard asked me, he was like, if you're spending hours on refining and carefully crafting your textures, why should you not do the same with your sounds? They are a big part of the project, and they add context to your visuals. Now, let's talk about how we can do that. So here's a visual, an axe. Now, there's another concept called abstraction, which honestly, it's taken me a little bit to get used to, but once I'm starting to understand it, it's really helpful because, my first instinct for a little bit was like, okay, axe, all right, what's the sound an axe make when it hits something? But there's a problem, which is that real life sometimes can be a little bit underwhelming. Let's go ahead and find this over here. Here we go. So this is a real sound of an axe hitting something. Yeah, it surprised me a little bit where I was like, okay, sure. And that's a bit underwhelming. So check out this one that I designed. And there we go. That's a big, powerful sound. Now, it can be intimidating because you're like, oh, how am I ever going to get that fantasy axe sound? Do I have to buy a pack where someone already made it? You can make those sounds out of other sounds. This is where the power of a compound sound comes into play. So let's take a look at this slice sound that I found. And I'm actually going to pull up something here, which is I'm going to showcase. Don't worry too much about this. It's an equalizer, and it's going to show us what parts of the frequency range are lighting up. But we're just going to have this in the background for visual aid. So we pull up this first sound. It's a little slicey. It's a little dash. And, on its own, nothing too crazy. Then we got the shiny sound. That's like the little plinky sound that a lot of metal makes. We put those together. All right, now we're getting a little bit of movement. We're implying a movement with that swipey sound, and we're implying an impact with that clinky sound. But we're not really selling it yet. So let's bring in what I'm going to call our primary sound, which is the sound that you're going to hear the most. And that's a clash that I found. That's two swords hitting each other, and it's got some deep end where you can see that it really lives around this range. And an important part when you're building these compound sounds is you want to try and fill out your entire spectral range. Not too much, but like you want to have a little bit of low, high, and medium in your sounds because that's partially how we communicate and hear the world. For example, our voice has almost the entire range of sounds in it, and they all represent different kind of parts of how someone's voice sounds. Now, let's go ahead and add in this next part. That's deep, and you can see how it's lighting up the back part of this, the low register, a lot more. And on its own, that might be like, that's kind of like distant and doesn't quite feel right. But let's try putting them all together here. Oop, gotta select them all. All right, now we've started to find something that really feels very flashy. And I'm being kind of silly, but I actually kind of strained my hand a little bit because when I was working on this project, which is in VR, I was listening to the sound and be like, how does it feel when it hits something? And really feel that energy because you want the sound to resonate with the player. Now, I could tell there was something missing though, and this is where we add in one more thing. And when you add in these extra sounds that add a little bit to your bass sound, they're called sweeteners. And my favorite sweetener so far has been the sound of wood being chopped, which is this. And it's really bassy, and it's like just a nice, just boom, that's a choppy impact sound. So we throw all that together, and there we go. And you can see how it pretty evenly lights up the space, and by taking low-end sounds, high-end sounds, movement, and just feeling it out, feeling like when I was designing this, I was like, it needs some more low-end. And then I was scrolling through my things, and I was like, ooh, wood being chopped. Don't be afraid to use abstract sounds, because if you're like, it's an axe, I can only use metal, you know, that's going to limit you. You're going to want to try other sounds and find unexpected solutions, because we are telling a story, not necessarily recreating exactly what a real world axe would sound like, because a dwarven axe from a fantasy realm shouldn't sound like a real axe. It should sound like its own thing. And I think that's the really important part of these compound sounds, is that this is how you make something out of something smaller. Lots of little pieces, and you put them together. Now, so if the big takeaway from this, if you have the time, don't just drag and drop. The best sounds are often custom designed to fit your needs. And across my entire time on this project, wherever I can, even if it's just 1 or 2 layers, I'm just adding a little bit more to make sure that our sound actually has some intention behind it. It is not just a sound I found. Because whether you're a sound designer like me or someone trying to just get sound into your game, it's important that it has intention, because that's what makes something really resonate with people, when someone was thinking about something when they made it. Now, this is a lot of information I just mentioned, and you can imagine it could be a lot to keep track of. So staying organized is as important as it is in every other type of art, and especially so in some of these programs, because this can get a lot. And so having consistent naming conventions, having consistent ways of organizing your stuff, and trying to keep things evenly spaced out so that you're not going to go crazy trying to find everything is really important. You don't want to be struggling to find something at 3 a.m. when your boss is like, hey, we need that sound tomorrow. And for example, for the first time, I should have done this earlier, all throughout school, I was always kind of loosey-goosey with naming conventions. I took it very seriously on this latest project I've been working on, and it has saved me so many times, because, you know, the sounds are already in the game. The programmer has a bunch of sounds that I gave him that are placeholders, and they're named something like Enum Crane Attack 01. And then he can get those in the game and working. And then as I'm designing the sounds, I can put them into the project, have them overwrite the existing file, and then I just went from it being in my DAW to in the game, and the programmer didn't have to do anything. And that's one of the magic parts of having consistent naming conventions and organizing with the people who are putting your game together, to make sure that you've got a pipeline to get, because in all of my projects, the worst part always was, it'd be like, you know, you're 2 weeks away from finishing, and, you know, let's say you were working with an outsourced sound designer. You're like, okay, we finally got those sounds in. And then the programmer's like, what? Now I got to program 200 sounds in an afternoon or something? Like, so as early as possible, you want to get sounds out there that have naming conventions that you can then replace. And this goes for if you're a sound designer, or really any type of asset artist, it's useful to have consistent naming conventions and placeholders. Okay, now, I just listed a ton of information, and it can be really intimidating to try and figure out, like, okay, but how do I know if it's good, though? And the answer is, if it sounds good, it is good. And that's something I heard from Professor Akers, and it's something that many people have said. And it's truly the truth of sound design, which is that we're just trying to make stuff sound good. And so you don't have to think super hard always about, I showed you that spectrogram and stuff, and you can do analysis where you can be like, oh, I'm focusing in on the 800 hertz range of wherever. And there are people who are really good at that and use that to their advantage. But at the end of the day, you've got your ears and you know what sounds good to you. So when you're working on these things, design it until it feels good and design it in context, because when you put sounds in a game, they sometimes sound a lot better than they sounded on their own. That has happened to me a lot, where I was like, there's no way this plinky sound is going to sound good in the game. And then when you got the music, the background, the enemies, the other stuff. In fact, I got tricked by this idea, and I'm going to tell you a very short story, which is when I was doing my project for Studio 3, I was doing a project called Antibody, and it was like a sci-fi shooter. And I was doing some research, and I was listening to the sounds of the guns in Fallout 4. And I remember being like, man, these sounds are way wimpier than I remember, because they're like little like pew pew, point, choom. And I was like, I thought they were so much bigger. And so when I was designing my sounds, I made them really big. I made them have a lot of energy. They were like really loud and big and energetic. And then I heard 30 of those going off at the same time from all the different enemies. And I was like, oops, never mind. Now I know why Fallout, they've got like 30 guns going off. They got to have space. And that's where, you could design an amazing sounding sound in your little DAW, but you got to hear it in the game, feel it in context, because that's going to tell you if it's good, is if it works for your thing. And so don't get too stuck in some of the technicals of it. Put stuff in and test it out. Okay, now that is that one whole topic. Big breath and now more information. So let's talk about voice acting and recording. When I got brought in to, and I haven't super mentioned what the project I got brought in to do is, but I got hired by Garage Collective to help them out with doing voice acting and sound effects and ambience for a VR game. And when they came to me, it was, one of the big things was like, we've got a big script, we've got a lot of voice actors, we got to get it done. And I'd done a little of this before in SCAD, but it was a thing where I felt like I wish someone would have talked to me even a little bit in school about this, because it's just such a amorphous thing. I always felt like I was kind of making it up as I went along. So I'm going to give you some information about how to get what I'm going to call script to engine and how to give your character's voice. Now, if you've got characters or not, it's still worth considering, because, for example, you could have a game with no dialogue, but if your character gets hit, you still might want them to say something, which might mean like oof or whatever. And that sort of little detail can really bring a lot to your game. So here's an example of a script that I was given by my writer. And here you can see these are the file names. These are the names that are already in the game with like some, I actually went through and I spent about an hour and a half reading every single line in the game in my talking voice and just saved them all as the names and got them all in so that the quest designer could implement my sounds while I was still working on actually getting them recorded with the actors. Now, what you can see here is we've got the NPC, the text, and the file. Now, there's a ton of ways you could do a script, but the most important thing is that you can get it to the person and it's prepared, because actors like to be able to rehearse stuff. And if you can get it to them a few days early, if they're looking at it even a day before they're in the room with you, you're going to get a better performance. So it's important to think about and also read your script out loud, because sometimes stuff that feels right when you're typing it doesn't always work out when someone tries to say it out loud. Now, all right, let's talk about where you can do this. In Monty, there's a thing called the Whisper Room, and it's near like the back annex near the weird chairs and stuff. Real ones know what I'm talking about. And it's a room called the Whisper Room, and you can ask the Cage to book it out. And it's a little studio that has a little booth with a microphone and a computer that you can run Adobe Audition on, or Pro Tools if you know how to use it. But I'd recommend Adobe Audition because that one's very similar to things like Adobe Premiere. And basically, if you want to get dialogue in your game, find an actor. It can even be your friends, and book out this room and just see if you can maybe find someone else who's done it before to help you it out, because it's just so much better to do it the proper way than like record into your iPhone. And you're going to get a much better product that's going to sound a lot more professional. Now, let's talk about how to sound professional with a microphone. So, you've got your, we call them talent usually, and they're in the little booth, and you're like, where do I tell them to stand? Well, they want to be in front of the microphone. And in my music production class I took at SCAD, they talked about a hand rule. Now, I learned it with the hand open. This graphic shows it with the hand closed. The idea is pretty much the same. You want to have about a hand's distance away from the microphone, because if you're too close to it, it's going to be too bright. And like loud, if you're too far away, they're not going to pick it up. Now, here's another thing that is really, really important. There's a concept of being on or off access. So here I've got a very popular microphone, the Blue Yeti, and its access in certain modes, it's just going to be pointing straight forward. So if I hold it over here, I'm missing out on a lot of detail in my voice. And so it's important just have it in front of you. And you can see that kind of here. Now, other things, there's things like pop filters and foam screens. I don't have one around me, but that's something that allows you to manage what are called plosives, which are the p sound when you talk about plosives. I don't know. And it's a sound that our mouth makes that gets really blown up by microphones because of the way that microphones work. And so it's important, and I think a lot of the studios have them, but that's already, if you can get rid of that poppy sound in your recordings, it's already going to sound way more professional. Now, the reason I have this microphone with me is because this microphone is very famous for being misinterpreted. A lot of people see a microphone like this and they're like, I talk into it like this because that's how microphones are held. But this is what we call a side address microphone, meaning that it is talked into from the front, like this. And if you don't know what type of microphone you're looking at, you can just look at the name of it and Google it. But basically, you're not going to get good sound if you talk to the microphone like this. It's important to just look at it, and often you can tell from the design where the biggest shape is probably the part I want you to talk into. So here you can see the difference between a side address and a top address microphone. And for reference, most microphones you're going to see in a studio are going to be side address because they like to have them mounted. So, and that includes the Whisper Room studio. Now, something else that we don't need to get super deep into, but this microphone, the Yeti, has a bunch of different modes. And sometimes people are like, which mode do I use? Well, in short, if you're recording dialogue, you want to use cardioid, which is the front-facing microphone recording style. It picks up basically mostly what's in front of it and tries to ignore what's behind it. And honestly, you don't need to worry about the other ones for dialogue because they're useful for different things. So, now, when you're looking at a piece of dialogue, sometimes you'll see something that looks like this, where, let's boost it there. You see something where you're in your audio program, oops, you're in your audio program and you get lost. You're in your audio program and you see a block and you're like, that's weird. And that is most likely an example of clipping, which is not good usually, unless you're playing like electric guitar, because clipping is distortion. When you put distortion on a guitar, you're removing information by cutting off parts of the signal, and it makes it sound really cool and buzzy. But it makes voices sound pretty bad usually. Again, unless you're making music, where the rules are different, I guess. But if you've got a character who's having an emotional scene where they're like, you know, I sang an emotional line and make sure that they're not blowing up the microphone like you can see here on the bottom part, because it's going to sound bad. And so if you're working on something and you're looking at the sound wave and you're seeing it turn into a rectangle, that's a sign to either have the person stand back a little bit or turn down the gain knob. And in the Whisper Room, you're most likely going to see what's called an audio interface, which is how we connect microphones to computers. And you're probably going to see something that looks a little bit like that, and that's a knob that you can turn down. It's important to watch these things because I spent way too long, honestly, confused about what these symbols mean. And it's surprisingly simple. It's like, hey, if it's red, it's too loud, you know? And it's important to, all of these little things add up to really give you something that can sound way better than you would have guessed. You don't need expensive equipment necessarily even to get a good recording. You just need to put in that extra time to set it up. Now, let's go ahead and give a few really quick practical examples. So when we are looking at this sound, one of the things that I do when I'm recording with people is I got myself a clapboard. And clapboards traditionally are used for film, and they have information about the take that they're on, and then they have this thing that makes a loud sound. And the loud sound is so that the person can synchronize the film and the audio. In fact, that's why our professor here clapped at the beginning of the video. And what's cool though is you don't need to just do that for video. You can have someone make a loud sound to indicate something occurring right here. So for example, I have my actor here.
Return to me.
I have them clap in between takes because now when I'm editing this and it's late at night and I'm tired and all this stuff, I can just go boom, boom, and I know where my takes start and end. And in fact, there's even tools that you can use to automatically split them based off of transients is what these are called when they're really big sections of sound. Now, let's say there was some noise in the background, or we couldn't get the whisper rooms we recorded on an iPhone. So here I've simulated a very noisy recording.
While magic is
and you can hear that little bit of crackle, right? Yeah, so what we can do is we can use, that's so funny. I've already denoised it. Let's do that again so we can actually hear the crackle for real. There we go, there's the crackle.
While magic is...
And that could ruin a recording. But what's cool is there's lots and lots of tools that you can use to remove that sound. And Audacity even has a built-in one called like noise reduction. Now, I'm using one from a company called Isotope RX, which is it's the industry standard for removing sound. But the critical thing you need to know about this is that with any of these tools, you select where your noisy sound is, and then you click a button that usually says something like learn. And that's going to it needs to be on. And that's going to analyze your sound. And you can hear how it reduced it. And we can be more and more aggressive and adjust the threshold and stuff. And now this is a very noisy track, so it's not fully removing it, but if you've just got a bit of background noise, it can usually remove it entirely. And so look at the difference where we've got this, it's looping.
While magic is common with Fiskrat,
that's removed, and
while magic is common with Fiskrat,
it's really important to avoid having noisy recordings because that's one of the biggest things that's going to make your stuff sound unprofessional. Speaking of things that can make your thing sound unprofessional, so I got this recording from my sister, actually. She's a little cameo as a character in this, and she sent this to me from her iPhone.
Oh, thank you.
Now, this might seem obvious, but I've made this mistake before. You're like, okay, we got the dialogue, let's send it in. But not so fast. We want to make sure that it actually starts on something that doesn't have any volume, and we probably want it to fade in a little bit. We want to cut out this little clip.
Oh!
That little clacking sound that they made.
Oh!
We don't want that clack, that little mouth clack. So we want to have it start right here.
Oh, thank you.
And then we want to end it before we get any noise. You know, so it's really important to just take that little extra bit of time and really give it a proper fade out that this is now going to make it sound less like something that you recorded on an iPhone. And just those small changes where you're not hearing the handling of it.
Oh, thank you.
You know, it's not great, but it's there. That's how you can get those little details that can really showcase how something was recorded. The more of those things you can take out, the more professional it can sound. Now, because yeah, there's actually still a little bit of noise in that, and I could do more work to remove it. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the next topic here, which is giving your trailer sound. So this is something that is really important. when you're making your trailer, make sure you give it some sound, especially talking to the Studio 2 and 3 people. It's so important because it just adds context. And I did all the sound for my trailer for my game Antibody. And when I was doing it, basically I had some in-game footage with some of the in-game sounds, but I removed quite a bit of it. And in fact, I recorded those without the music running. So basically I turned the music off, hit record, got gameplay, and in that gameplay I had some of my sounds. But then what I did is I amped up those sounds and made them a bit more cinematic, added those sweeteners, and cut music to fit the timing. And I threw in background sounds and the enemy saying something right before they appear, and all of these little details that is cinematic that you can't just do in the game. But when you're presenting your thing as a trailer, it's important to take advantage of the medium to take it that one step higher and apply some of these nice additional effects that you can do when you're in the world of Adobe Premiere or whatever it might be. So when you're sitting down to make your trailer, just go on a sound website and be like, I bet it would sound cool if there was a big rumble here. And don't leave it at one, because one rumble, let's say there's a big monster on screen, one roar, people will be like, oh, they clearly just pulled that from somewhere. But if you get a few of those and time them right and balance them, change their audio levels in relationship to each other, you can really craft something that's going to stand out and be a cool moment in the trailer where you've got emphasis. Now, other small detail, don't worry too much about this, but when you're in engine, there's a thing called phasing. And phasing is also another famous guitar effect, which is when two copies of a signal interfere with each other. Now, let's say you're in a world and you've got two torches right next to each other. If you have them play the exact same sound, and then the player moves around, you can see in this diagram of waves, those waves are going to interfere, and you're going to get this really weird electronic sounding distorted sound. And so it's important to have variations of your sound. You saw that I had 5 of variations of that axe. Now, my teacher told me that the magic number for psychoacoustics, which is the study of sound in the brain, is 7. 7 is usually the really good number where people can't really tell that a sound has been repeated if you randomize 7 of them. Now, sometimes 7 is too many. 7 sounds like maybe not a ton for one sound, but if you're talking about 50 sounds, 100 sounds, 200 sounds, it can get a lot. So don't overcommit yourself. I originally was like, oh, I'm gonna do like nine axe sounds for every single one, and then realized how fast that was not going to work with the time I had. But even 1 or 2 variations, and then throw on a little pitch variation, throw on a little volume variation, even just pitch and volume can be enough to avoid phasing. So in tools like the sound cue of Unreal Engine, you can have it randomize your sounds, and you can have them turn the pitch to be random and make the volume slightly random, so then when you place 2 torches, they won't be playing the exact same sound wave that will then cancel out in weird ways. And there's a lot more that could be said about implementing sound in Engine, but it's a whole nother kind of topic. And one of the things I was really hoping to do, because I got taught how to do stuff in the engine, I felt like I missed out on a lot of the fundamentals. So that's part of the reason why I'm mentioning some of this stuff in the more hypothetical. All right, other big takeaways. You're capable of more than you know in both sound and everything else. Very recently, I ended up designing 600 sounds in 4 days. Now, most of those were those variations I was talking about. But just a year ago, that would have taken me months. I did more in a few days than I did in like an entire month last year. And every time you're working on something, even if you feel like, man, I gotta be faster, man, I'm not doing enough, you're learning things that the next time you do it, it's gonna get faster, it's gonna be better. And I really was shocked at how much faster I could do things. I spent several days editing just like 3 voice acting takes last year. And then I ended up doing, in about a month, like 12 different actors, 180 lines of dialogue, and I was just breezing through them because I had developed a workflow. And so you are capable of not only doing sound, but of pretty much anything that you put your mind to, as long as you give yourself a chance to develop that workflow and look for ways to get faster in the tools you're using. Now, if you can't find opportunities, make them and provide them to others. This is something that was really important to me because when I was doing my project, I was kind of like, for Studio 2 and 3, I was like, hey, if anyone doesn't have a team, join up with me because I'm looking for people. Because I wasn't really getting reached out to. And I wanted to also be able to really do something unique and provide some opportunities for both myself and other people through a collaborative effort. And when you see opportunities like that, if you're like, oh, man, I just can't get a gig, I can't get a project, no one wants to reach out to me, that sometimes is a sign that maybe you should be that person to reach out to other people and put something together, because some of the people that I worked with last year ended up basically saving the day for me. A year later, my main voice actor in this project, I was like, oh man, I've got to find 8 more actors in like the next 2 weeks. And he was like, oh, let me call up my friends. And I got like 12 auditions in the next like weekend. And people know people who can help you. And so when people talk about networking as like it's this ambiguous thing where it's like, oh, I got to go out and network at GDC, but networking can start now in SCAD, in your classroom, where people that you're working with, you will probably see them again. And because in the next 10 years, they're going to be the people who are working in the industry. And so help some people out, and they might help you out in ways that you don't expect and can really help you in times when you need it. So now on that note though, make it easy for people to get in touch with you. One of the guys that I reached out to almost didn't get a voice acting gig because I couldn't find his email. So I know Professor Gouchard has talked about this probably before, but make sure your LinkedIn has like a working email, all that stuff, because not everyone is going to have 20 minutes to search around and try. It turns out it was in the end of his reel, but it wasn't on his LinkedIn. Not everyone's going to have time for that. So don't make it hard to find you. And I mentioned this earlier, but don't underestimate abstraction. Sometimes I at times was thinking of things too literally, too specifically. Allow yourself to be representational, because sometimes that's what actually requires more thought and more effort than being realistic, and it can really be artistic in a good way. Finish the year strong. The work that I did in Studio 1, 2, and 3 is what then was on my portfolio and got me this job. And it's really important that you put your best effort into these projects, because they're what you're going to be going to and talking about, like, this is what I'm capable of. So for my Studio 1, I pushed myself to do something I hadn't really done at all before, which was recording actors. And then that ended up being the thing that these people needed, and they reached out to me and were like, oh, it looks like you can do that. And that's the power of your portfolio. And then having breakdowns that explain that you know what you're doing. It's important to set those things up so that people can find you and believe that you can do the work. Now, something that is kind of obvious, but also kind of silly, on this project, I made a few mistakes. That can suck. It can be really tough. It can be really easy to be like, oh man, I really messed it up. Okay. And then the important thing is, and that's going to happen when you're in the professional world. That's always going to happen. And so the important thing is, if that's kind of where you leave it off at, people are like, oh yeah, isn't that the guy who messed up or whatever? But if you keep working and keep pushing things, let your accomplishments speak for you, and a lot of those mistakes will, if you can own them and move past it and deliver good stuff, it won't be the thing that defines you. So it's important. No one's going to just perfectly go through working. You're going to make mistakes. So when you do, tell people about them so that you have a chance to fix them and keep moving forward. And also, don't wait till you're out of time. I've done that a little bit on this one. I always do this. I'm getting better at it. It's hard. Something doesn't always feel real until you're out of time. So don't wait until you're out of time. Start this stuff as soon as you get a project. Start thinking about how you can do the sound as well as your other things, because a phenomenon that is painful is oftentimes, I feel like in sound, if you're not careful, your placeholder becomes your final. In all of my SCAD projects, sound that I was like, this will just be a placeholder, became the final because there was no longer any time to fix it. So try and pace things out. Don't like try and do this all in one afternoon. It's sound design, just like any other form of art, isn't something you should be rushing in an afternoon. It's something that you want to space out and give yourself time to do properly. Now, Hamilton Hall, Adler Hall, and the Whisper Room have a program called SoundQ on them. This has access to over 300,000 sounds that are professional libraries. They are through SCAD's academic license, and you can use them on your projects as long as they're nonprofit. If you don't know about this, go check it out. It's super underutilized, and it's a really nice interface. And I am currently paying $30 a month to this company for access to their more standard library. And it's, if you're interested in sound design stuff, look into things like this. But you don't have to go all the way to Adler Hall to get access to some of those sounds. If you open this link on any SCAD network computer, it will open up access to the website version of that program. And it doesn't have access to all of the sounds, but it still has it says 400,000 or something. This is where you should be looking for your sounds. Now there's a limit to the amount that you can download each day. So don't just select them all and hit download, download what you need, because I think other students are using it and stuff. But the reason I mentioned SoundQ is I don't think SoundQ has the same limit. In fact, I think the sound design department are trying to phase out this website because I don't think they like it. But regardless, check out this link on a SCAD computer, see what you can find. Don't limit yourself to just random sounds you can find. Now, speaking of random sounds you can find, do check out Freesound, though. I recently started posting some of my work on there. It's awesome. It is a website where people post sounds that are free. A lot of people do entire indie games with this. A significant amount of the famous sounds from Minecraft were Freesound sounds from the early 2000s. And what's really cool is there's different types, but the one you probably want to look for is CC0, which just means you can use it without any credit. You can also look for sounds that do have credit and stuff, but for example, I've been posting all my sounds as CC0, partially because I just use so many sounds from places like this that it's cool to be part of it. And also, if you find yourself recording a cool sound, throw it up here. I was surprised. People have downloaded some of my sounds way more than I ever thought. Metal Plate Hit 2 has been downloaded 37 times. That's kind of crazy to me. Or it's some random sound I threw up there. And something that was really funny, I just put up a random sound of a trunk closing, and someone wrote a comment. They're like, "Thank you so much. This is exactly what I needed to finish my project." I was like, "Oh, that's so cool." So, there's lots of cool little things like that all over the place. Now, if you're looking for even more information, these are two books that I'm currently reading through. I've read one of these before for one of my classes. They're really good, and they talk about some of the technicals of these things. This one is actually talking about the physics and synthesis behind sound design, and this one is talking more about the theory of it. And the denoising software I showed off, I didn't show the craziest demo of it, but it is legitimately incredible. And it's usually $50 on sale. If for some reason you find yourself doing a lot of sound cleanup, it's worth checking out Isotope RX. And you can contact me at that email, and that's my website, and that's my LinkedIn. I am, this project I've been working on. This is another thing that was kind of, I was talking to some other people and stuff. I had this idea that I was just gonna magically get, like a AAA opportunity. Um, I mean, I was starting to not believe in that anymore, probably about after my first year in school. But like, it might take a little bit, especially with the way that the industry is currently. And so, for example, the job that I've been working on, it's a contract, and it's don't be afraid to take some contracts, do some work with your friends, keep working on your portfolio, because I can say currently, as someone still looking for my true first like full-time job where I'm showing up every day doing that work, the way you're going to get there is through knowing people and through working on your portfolio. And so if you have any questions about sound design or things like that, or I would love to talk to people about how their job search is going because it's tough out there. Feel free to reach out. Yeah, so that is everything. Thank you so much for listening to my little talk there.
Awesome.
Whew.
Awesome. And for those of you that also want to reach to Logan, it's okay to contact you on Discord,
Yes,
correct?
it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Logan is also on our Discord server. I think I tagged him announcement. I believe Logan will also give me access to the
Yes.
presentation. So once I have the recording, I will also post the presentation. Do we have any questions? Is there anybody that has
I'll take any questions. Yeah.
Anyone? Raise your hand or just no?
Sure, I'll have one.
Yeah.
So, hey Logan, good to see you again.
Hey.
I'm currently working on my VR horror title. I'm working with mod. This is my first time kind of like diving really deep into the software. And I like what you're talking about with abstraction, because that's something that I'm kind of struggling with, is we'll have sounds and like, well, I want this to sound like how it doesn't always sound like how you think you'd sound. I had like a rusty wheel turning, and I had like a sound that I had, and I was like, this isn't quite right. And then I looked online, I was like, yeah, see, that's the sound that I want. It's got like a big squeak and things like that. So I'm just wondering kind of if you have any resources or ideas on how to understand abstraction, like real sounds versus abstract sounds, and how abstract sounds are done in like other games.
Yeah, so I'll give you, this is honestly, so I had originally a few slides about this, and I partially cut it because it's something that is so, it's not one thing, right? It's not something that you can cut down into one thing, but I'll try and, so one of the things that I thought was really interesting is I went to a sound talk where, if anyone's seen the movie Kill Bill, they have, like, there's a scene where, like, all those like ninja guys run in. The sound designer for that was saying that that was done with a sack of potatoes being rolled down a staircase. And like, whenever you hear sounds like stories like that, you're like, really? Like, and then, but it's because exactly what you're talking about. And here's the way to think of it. You're designing for what it feels like. And so if to some degree, if you're like, if your director or your friend is like, man, I feel like it should feel like just like, like a herd of bull just come running in, and you're like afraid of this big monster. The first step would be bull running, and listen to those. It's very allegorical and metaphorical in a way that is often very funny, where I'll give you a very specific example. For a scene that I did, this is my favorite example of abstraction, and I actually have a breakdown for this. So I did a scene from the game Prey where they inject something called a neuromod. So I guess warning if you're afraid of needles or things. Because part of the reason why I chose this scene is it was so visceral in the game. I was like, oh, I gotta try this out. Where the game it's someone basically injecting neurons into their brain. And it's got this crazy visual. And when I was designing it, that's the wrong place. When I was designing it, I was considering all these different ways. And for example, my favorite one is I had the sound of someone diving into water as you see this kind of effect of this wet inner mind space. And I'll play it for you. And so you can see how there's a lot going on in that sound. That's one of my most complicated sound scenes I've done. There's like 17 different layers or something. But
Hmm.
there you can see, all right, I physically, all that's happening in the real world is someone's sticking a needle through the back of their eye socket. That's just going to sound like a grape or something, but that's too boring. So we are selling the emotion of it's technology, it's creepy, it's futuristic. So that's why we've got those camera lenses and power zapping sounds, all stuff that doesn't really make sense, but it feels
Hmm.
right. And that is a big part of the design of robots is like, so I'll tell you something really interesting, which is this is the conundrum of abstraction. People have often been like, the people who made Star Wars, they're so silly. They don't even know that lasers don't make sounds in space or whatever. But here's the thing. Would those scenes be as iconic if they were silent? No. And like that's what abstraction is about, where it's like, and I something that I think I'll put this even a different way, that this is the moment lesson that just stands out to me from Professor Gouchard is I was producing a scene in 3D for my game, and I was like, all right, so here's the thing. It's kind of weird because it's made by robots, and robots don't know how to design cities, so it's going to be a little bit off. And what Professor Gouchard said was they're going to look at that and think you don't know how to design cities. So any sort of like moment where you're like it's a little bit weird and a little bit different because like of some thing, but if the player doesn't know that, the player's just going to be like, oh, maybe they're just bad at it. So,
Yeah.
like whenever you try and come up with some super logical explanation for stuff, sometimes you're missing the point of the art. Where, imagine if George Lucas was like, oh, actually, it's, because Star Wars isn't a hard sci-fi exploration of what it means to be in space. It's a fun movie. So if he was like, actually, it would be completely silent because of this and this, you'd be like, oh, come on. Like, but versus if you're talking about like the movie Gravity, like they have a scene that's completely silent, I think, and it's one of the craziest parts of it because the tonality fits what they're doing. So I think
Hmm.
considering your theming and being willing to just put reality aside for a second and have fun with it, because for this sound, as you saw the different layers, you've got water diving, stuff squishing, stuff blinking and zapping and twisting and turning. It's all to represent what would it feel like to imagine getting your brain rearranged by like some weird alien technology, which
Hmm.
is so much more interesting than just stabbing a grape and calling it a day. Now,
Yeah.
versus if you're designing this is a scary-ish game, but if it was a pure horror game, something that I think this is another example of abstraction, and this is where things sometimes take it a bit too far, but it's a perfect example of what does it mean for abstraction to really work. So there's a thing called a water phone, and it is abused to hell by the industry of reality TV. So if we look up the water phone SFX, it's this sound. We're gonna hear it in a second here. Come on, do it. Okay, here we go. And here's the funny thing. That is an obscure instrument. But when you hear that, you're like, they just messed up. They just put onions in the whatever, and they were supposed to use like garlic or something. Like, there's a term called reification. And this is, I think, where we can really start to learn more about what it means to abstract something. Reification is when you add a layer of meaning above something's literal definition. I'm not sure I'm giving that entire. This is a high level concept that I'm still trying to really understand and grasp around. But basically, if you play that sound enough times, it becomes reified to mean mistake, bad. You should feel awkward. This person just said something cringe in front of the judges. It stops meaning the sound of running a bow against a glass over water, which is what it is, and it starts to mean something else. And so when you're looking for abstraction, look for those cultural reifications, which is and I think Arcane did there's an example I can think of this of Arcane, which is when they have some of the crazy machines that Jinx is messing with when she's fighting and stuff. You're hearing like slot machine sounds sometimes, and cranks and all sorts of stuff that is not visually even on the machines sometimes. I mean, they've got elements of them, but it sounds like a whole vibe of, you know, crazy clockwork noises. They are reifying, they are bringing it just from a machine sound to a sound that has a certain vibe associated with a certain type of feeling. And this is where it becomes really hard to describe because it's just such a complicated metaphorical concept. But the advice I would have is, if you're, for example, for chopping wood and stuff, the way I found that one is I was like, all right, I'm working on an axe. I typed axe. I saw axe going into wood. People have a vague idea of what an axe going into wood feels like. It's splitting, it's tearing, it's... That is a sound that when you play it on top of something else, people are going to feel it as being, ooh, something big just happened. And so I think it's very easy to be like, I got to abstract it. What random objects can I think of? But instead, it's actually has a lot less to do with the object, a lot more to do with their cultural meaning. And so I've been talking for like 10 minutes about this, but it's a very complex topic. And so when I'm looking through things, though, it is about, I think the final kind of example would be people, like partially because of the whole Monty Python thing, but if you hear two coconuts clacking together, you're going to think of like a horse galloping. And that's partially because people made that sound for long enough with coconuts that now people kind of think of it that way. And so it's a mix of what do you have around, and also this is where the visuals come in, because I think this is actually the other aspect that really sells something. You can have a sound that sounds awesome, but if the visual's weak, it might not sell it. But, you know, let's say if you've got like a sound of like, you know, an impact, and you could just put a little bit of dust in the sound, like the sound of sand, and if there's a big sand gunshot like spray, it's gonna, feel like something big just happened because the visuals and the audio are syncing. So when you're talking about horror and stuff, I think the thing that you do is you'd think of the aesthetic of horror and be like doors creaking, rusty chains, making metal doors. Think of scary places, prison ambience, you know, caves, dungeon. Those are the keywords that you're typing. And when you're working on a effect library, so take a look at this library here. They are done in something called the UCS, the Universal Category System. And so you can, one, you know, they're filled with keywords. So here the description of this sound is, you know, balloon squeal, buzzy, air release, pulsing, squeaky, harsh. And the idea being if I type in harsh, you know, different things show up. And then they're categorized by air and hiss. So a way to think of abstraction is like, what are sounds that are hissy? Snakes, balloons, tire pumps. And that's how you build it out. You build it through kind of free association and webs. And I think, honestly, the cultural thing is the best one, where, you know, sound of a nail going through a board or something harsh and visceral that relates to the imagined visuals of horror can then sound like horror because those are connected culturally. Oh my gosh, that was a lot. Okay, so Gush has a question.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah.
What I kind of wanted to kind of piggyback on this, to go back to and talk to Christian as well, is like, I think one of the things that Logan said at the beginning is kind of like, it's the beginning of an answer for you as well on this. It's like when you take a sound, it just doesn't kind of like put just one sound or think of, okay, well, this is the axe eating, blah, blah. It kind of layers it with other things. And so if you just assume that you're never going to use a sound by itself, but you're going to always layer it with other things, it's going to force you to think, okay, what other things? And so it will force you to look at maybe what is the result of the sound, or what is the result of the action, or how is the player going to kind of feel about it. And so I think naturally, if you start layering your sounds, if you start compounding them, you will naturally abstract them.
Yes, I believe. And I think that that's exactly what you were seeing in the way I made that neuromod scene was practically free association. I was like, oh, that kind of looks like water sound. Ooh, if I've got a water sound, I should have a diving sound. Ooh, like all these different things. Oh, if they're diving, should there be splashing? Let yourself think about those things and stack them, hear how they sound. And the other thing too with horror stuff is reverb, delay, time stretching, all of those things. You can make something sound, the further you can make it sound from something that people have heard before, you can take something normal and, okay, this is actually a really, really cool example of something. So something I'm doing right now that is horror adjacent is I want to make a character sound kind of creepy. And I'm doing like this weird like digital monster thing. So I recorded this voice. Why didn't you do more? Or something, just me whispering into a microphone. Check this out. We throw on some effects. Kind of crazy, right? And what you've got going on there is a lot of different effects, but it's essentially modulation, filtering, a driver, which is pushing that's that sound. And basically you can take something that would otherwise be normal and with effects push it into the realm of unnatural. And I'm pretty proud of how it came out. It's kind of crazy sounding, but it's so for like a weird digital monster creature that's crawling around and making loud noises that are supposed to unnerve the player, it's
Okay.
You can do stuff with your own voice, and it's awesome. Yeah. All right.
I think we may have time for one more question, short. And
Thank you so much for the question. That was a great question. I'm glad I got to talk about some of that because it's hard to fit into a straight box. Yeah.
This is less of a question and more of just a thank you for going over loops like you did, because I found myself in several situations where I've had to loop sounds before, either to make them shorter or to like repeat sections of a song for a trailer and whatnot in the past.
Yeah.
And it's always been a matter of me just like trying to get lucky and finding that zero spot. I've never been able to understand like what makes it successfully loop, and that just totally blew my mind when you pointed out that zero spot.
Yeah, because that blew my mind, because I remember hearing 2 years ago, I overheard a professor teaching a different class say the word zero crossing, and I was like, what the hell is that? And then like a month or two ago, I was doing more research trying to it all came together, and I was like, that's how you do it. And that's actually what like drove some of these decisions, is like some of this stuff's hard to Google. It took me a while to find images of a zero crossing error, and they're hard to produce, and it's one of those like subtle details that like just doesn't show up that much. So I'm glad it was useful. Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, we'll maybe we can do it more next quarter, like in fall. Dragon Ridge will have shipped. I have a final question for you that may be relevant to our students that are working on trailers. It's kind of rare that we have voice actors. It's kind of rare that, but it happens every now and then. Personally, the reason I'm so happy to have you on board is because I did not have to deal with voice actors. I did not have to deal with directing them, because we all know that the last time I did it was not very good. So I brought someone better than me, and that's you. Do you have any advice for like non-sound students? They have to work with a voice actor. It's not going to be a professional. It's most likely going to be another student or friend. What are like short, but what are like a few tips that you can give them?
So here's the big thing. Acting is the thing that all actors are going to, and if they're not a professional, they're going to struggle with subtlety, because subtlety, it's actually not that hard. For I worked with some people who are less experienced, and they'll be kind of like, if you ask them to do like kind of like dramatic anime voice with like, huh, the thing has been stolen. Like, you know, like people can do that okay. But like, I'm not really an actor, so I'm not going to give an example of a good, subtle one. But getting people to show emotion and things can be difficult. And so one of the ways that I addressed that is actually a really simple thing, which is breathe with your diaphragm. And it's something that you have to feel. So when someone, if you're asking someone to do a take that is sad, this can be kind of awkward, but you kind of basically have to say, remember a time that you felt sad and feel that while you're performing, because it's just not, and that's what real actors do, and it takes a lot of effort and it involves emotional vulnerability. But the way that you get good performances is, for example, the actor that did one of the voices that Professor Gouchard's favorite voice from one of the actors that we had was one where she seems genuinely concerned about the MacGuffin and what's going to happen to it. And that comes from the actor. She spent the time to embrace, how does this character feel? And so when you're talking to people who've never done this before, you can be like, remember something sad and put that into your voice, because it can change how you modulate it. And I'm not even that very good at acting, but you know, I could feel my eyes being a little bit teary, and I can make my voice just a little bit different. And I'm not very good at it, but some people are amazing at it. And when you get even that little bit of subtlety, that's what's going to make stuff sound at least a little bit more genuine. And then when you have, and the thing I said about breathing with the diaphragm is, people have a tendency to force things, especially when they're unexperienced. And that can come through on the throat and neck and stuff. And so basically, you kind of just have to tell them, like, chill out and breathe the way you would normally. Because there's a tendency for people to tense up and be like, I am saying the line, and I am so specific, and I've got all these thoughts, and I'm saying the line dramatically. But that's what reads often as bad acting. And if you can get them to, the idea is to have them stand up and be calm and read the line with feeling. Now, that can be really difficult. And then the other thing is, when you're giving feedback on it, try not to say things that are vague. Try not to be like one of my voice actors, they were complaining, they're like, people will be like, I really want to feel happy when I hear this. And she was like, I don't know what that means. So when I was guiding people, I was saying things like, try lifting up the tonality at the end. I felt like it ended weird. And like, be like, you know, instead of going like, the whatever is here, ? Like, try going, the whatever is here. Like, stuff like that. Subtle differences that, if you can really listen to what you're hearing, try and figure out what you do or don't like, and give them specific actionable advice that'll allow them to, you could be like, all right, you try it now a bit out of breath. Try it, take a big deep breath, you know, hold yourself as if you're a strong warrior or whatever. And it can feel really silly, but that's how you get some of those things out there.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think all of that was super helpful, particularly in a period where trailers are top of mind. So
Yes.
we are going to get a lot of sound. We are going to get a lot of sound work. We are going to get maybe some voice acting work. Well, I'll make sure to loop you in, Logan.
Yes.
And,
if anyone wants to send me anything, I'd be happy to give a light or heavy critique. You know, I don't have to be super intense, but I could just be like, oh, here's my thoughts on this. If you were like, tell me everything you would change, I can also do that. Feel free to reach out.
Yeah, Logan has offered multiple times to help, critique, and stuff like that. But now he's finished. He's content complete on Dragon Ridge, and now he has plenty. Well, you have a month, because then there is QA. Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I hope it was helpful. We have a nice blend of like seniors and juniors and stuff like that. So I hope that everybody got the information that they needed out of this. I will cut the recording and I will post it on Discord as soon as it's available, or as soon as I can get to it, which will most likely be Sunday. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Logan, for taking the time to talk to us. Good luck, you guys, on all that you're working on. And then see you guys on Monday. Logan, talk to you maybe on Monday. Goodbye, everybody.
All right, bye.
All right, thank
Thank
you.
you. Have a good time.